Our final topic before we go to lunch, we're going to dive into the electrofuels and e-fuels, electrochemical pathways to green molecule production. For this, we have our fantastic moderator, Mr. Jonathan Tudor, investment partner at Clean Growth Fund. Welcome to our stage, sir. Please take your seat. And he's going to be moderating Dr. Frederik Hetsch, Head of Science at Audacy Ventures, Ignacio Echavarria Diaz-Guardamino, CTO and Head of Engineering at Dovetail Electric Aviation, and Mathias, CEO and co-founder of Spark E-Fuels. When you are ready. And after this, you have a small lunch break. Okay, remember it's important you're back by 2. We have lots of other events here after the talks, the tech talks, and also you have time for networking. Right? It's very important. Lunchtime, you make some new contacts. And we hope you've enjoyed ourselves so far. Don't worry, sir. 1 second, we'll be with you. Welcome to our stage, sir. Just take a seat. So once again, our topic, electrofuels and e-fuels, electrochemical pathways to green molecule production. Okay. Welcome to our stage. Please take a seat. Thank you very much. Welcome, sir. Whenever you're ready, okay. Mr. Moderator, take it away.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. We're going to do a quick round of introductions, and then we'll get straight into it. So we're just going to do name and rank, number, pretty much. So I'm Jonathan. I'm a partner at the Clean Growth Fund in the UK. We're a broad climate. We do seed, Series A, any market, any sector. As long as each company can save at least 100,000 tons of carbon per annum, we will evaluate that as an opportunity. I'll hand over to Ignacio to my left.
Okay, so Ignacio Echavarria. I am the CTO and Head of Engineering at Dovetail Electric Aviation. We are aiming at producing retrofit kits for existing aircraft to make them fully electric or in the future hybrid hydrogen electric.
Yeah, hello. I'm Mathias. I'm CEO and co-founder of Spark E-Fuels. We are a climate tech startup developing conversion technologies for the production of sustainable fuels, especially for the aviation industry. The specific thing about us is we are developing load-flexible technologies that are able to cope with fluctuating inputs, like fluctuating renewables, to significantly cut cost. Thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm Frederik. I'm with Audacy Ventures. We're based in Hong Kong. Early stage VC from C to Series B in energy tech companies. So e-fuels definitely be part of it. We've invested in 14 companies, 4 of which are in the SAF space. So we're definitely very excited about the topic. As I said, we're based in Hong Kong, but the companies that we are investing in are predominantly in Asia Pacific to 50%, and then the other 50% is basically spread out between Europe and Northern America. As we all know, this is a global problem. So that's we're out of our base of Hong Kong. We're very happy to bring those companies and those techs back to Asia.
Okay. So we got 2 startups flanked by 2 investors here. So
yes.
just dawned on me. I just thought right at the beginning, it might be worth having come to you, Ignacio, to begin with about how do we define an e-fuel? Because we were commenting earlier, it can mean many things to many people. So to you, what?
Okay, so at least in the aviation sector, the way we think about e-fuels is something that's can allow decarbonization of the aviation industry, which, as you know, is very difficult. For that, as you know, electric aviation has several topics. You can go from the small aircraft to the very large aircraft, like the ones that can do Sydney to Paris in a single flight. And for that, different technologies are needed. And for those, we think that e-fuels should be both battery electric, hydrogen, and also SAF, as aircraft that are flying right now will fly for 50 years, and therefore you cannot convert all of them. So having SAF is something that's necessary. as an addition to the hydrogen and the electric that could actually be ready for some of the lower end flights.
Okay.
Yeah. So I guess that's a very interesting thing because to some extent my definition would be a little bit different and there is no exact definition of it. What we see as an e-fuel is very often it's really hydrogen and hydrogen derivatives produced with electricity, so to say. It's super important obviously that the electricity and also the input factors are sustainable because otherwise all of this e-fuels development doesn't really make sense. But there's also other applications than aviation, for example. That could also be methanol for shipping, could also be ammonia, for example. That's why we would see it then really as first producing hydrogen from water and then also the derivatives after that.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much how we see it. I think what also makes this picture sometimes a bit more complicated than there are crossovers to biofuels. I mean, that separation is good to start with, but then we see actually they might benefit from each other as well. So I think anything that uses electricity to produce an alternative fuel, we internally would qualify as an e-fuel. But we're not sector specific in that sense that we say we only do e-fuels. If there's an overlap, even better.
So I guess, in summary, in a way, I know we've got the title electrochemical pathways, right? But that kind of suggests there has to be energy put into the system to actually generate the fuel. Whereas if we're talking about hydrocarbons, there's energy to extract them, getting out of the ground, getting to the surface, right? So it has to be energy competitive if we're looking at all of those things. Yeah. So with that, what are the sort of promising and emerging technologies you're seeing, Mathias, sort of coming through that, in the research areas here that you think are on the cusp of being adopted?
That's a very good question, and it really comes down to that e-fuels is actually a very broad topic somewhat. There's various different technologies. It mostly depends on the input factor on the one hand, so what do you put in to your process and what's the output for the specific molecule that you want to have then in the end. So input can be only water, for example, if you want to go to hydrogen. Could also be water and CO2 as an input, and then you can go to methanol, you can go to jet fuel, you can go to other hydrocarbons, for example. Could also be ammonia, for example, which would also be like a product that you can get out of it. And then in each of these different steps, there's various actually technology developments currently going on. If you only look at hydrogen production, for example, the standard or the most common technologies that you would know is, for example, PEM electrolysis or alkaline electrolysis, but there's also high temperature electrolysis coming up and getting more mature, and also other type of electrolysis like anion exchange membranes that are interesting. And if you go further, like in jet fuel branch where we are working in also, there's various different conversion technologies then. So you start with producing hydrogen, then you go to a syngas, and then you go to hydrocarbons, and then further to a jet fuel there. So there's various different technology steps and various different advances in technology development and innovation in each of these steps. For example, what's very important is catalytic developments, like really further advancing the catalyst for higher conversion and for higher efficiency, for example. There's also reactor developments, so redesign the reactor and the overall process to make it less capex intensive, to make it more efficient, for example. That's also something that's coming up. Many of these technologies still depend on thermochemistry because that's the workhorse of the chemical industry currently. So it's known, it's really scalable. The other thing, what's also interesting is like the electrochemical pathways that are coming up, especially for conversion of CO2 to CO, for example. There's electrochemical pathways. The problem with these is very often that the yields are still pretty low, that it's not really scalable yet, and it's questionable if it's going to be scalable and how it's going to be scalable in the future, but it's very interesting to look at it. And the other thing that's coming up currently is plasma reactors, for example, where you use ionized gases in a plasma reactor and then try to get from CO2 to any valuable product. Can also be just CO, but can also be hydrocarbons, but most of the time it's very short hydrocarbons. And just at the end, what's super important with all of these different technology developments, in the future, it's not to have the best technology, but it's to have really the technology that works and is able to scale and get down this cost curve as much and good as possible.
Yeah, we're going to come back on the cost question because I think it's fundamental for the success of many of the things that you've mentioned. But Frederik as well, I know you, at Audacy, you spend a lot of time doing research and analysing what's coming forward before you place your investment bets. Same question to you about trends. Technologies that are coming forward.
Great. Yeah, no, I think I would echo what Mathias just said. I think there's sort of some technologies out there which I would call more revolutionary. So anything that's sort of in the plasma space, we have seen Plasma Leap, a company out of Australia that's basically a platform, but one of the early processes that they're looking at is green methanol, for example. So those are working on this. We've seen a company out of Helsinki looking at similar processes, trying to revolutionize chemistry in a way, with sort of the side effect to get to green methanol and ammonia and so forth. Those are the ones that have the potential to be revolutionary, but we also feel like from an investment perspective, it's probably still fairly early and therefore high risk. What we see more though is also evolutionary steps. So someone like Spark and Mathias and his team is working on is improving basically this fundamental problem that solar and wind is intermittent and is not a stable process. So how do you run a chemical, how do you run a chemical process that is inherently needs stable conditions to optimize it for a load that is intermittent and is not stable. So I think that part is very interesting because the cost decline that we have seen is predominantly in wind and solar, but unfortunately, as we all know, the input is not always stable. So if groups like Spark can solve for that, I think that's a big step in the right direction. And then just from a high level, it's basically all about the inputs, right? So you need cheap electricity, so solar and wind. Electrolyzers obviously is a big topic. So we had a chance to talk to Yolt this morning, a company out of Spain, and they try to optimize sort of that part as an input into the equation. But then also, of course, CO2 plays a big role. And we ourselves have invested in a company that is point source capturing CO2 out of the UK called Cool Planet Technology. So depending on the location, that becomes an option. And as I said, that crossover, I think that using biogenic CO2 will be interesting going forward. So last night I had a chance to talk to Nature Energy, basically running a process for biomethane and then has a chance to recycle some of the CO2 and run a separate process that could lead to other outputs like SAFs and so forth. So that's on the technology side. Just to close that point, I think a lot of these technologies are there. I think what's really helping and where sort of the innovation comes from is really the support from policies in those countries. So the IRA, the Green Deal in Europe. But then also what we see a lot with our background in project finance is how do you scale it then, right? Because it's all good if you can bring it to sort of a certain amount, certain output, but really you want to get it at a stage where a bank can come in and probably do a 70 to 80% debt financing for these projects. So I think that a lot of the technologies that are at this stage are luckily getting to that point where they become bankable.
Okay. You touch again on something around these production costs. I mean, the hydrocarbon industry has been around for decades. It's efficient. The distribution of the hydrocarbons is well understood. It's easy. It's known. But if I can come to you, Ignacio, I mean, what route do you see for production costs actually coming down? So they don't necessarily have to be at cost parity, but at least at a cost where the proposition that your company's offering starts to become tenable, becomes viable, that there isn't going to be a huge cost impact to the end user, the end customer, when we're saying, hey, this flight's going to be on an e-fuel basis. What do you think can be done in the near term? What's got yet to happen to allow the e-fuels to sort of get to be competing effectively with the hydrocarbons?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, the aerospace industry and also the automotive industry is very market-based, and therefore if you have a fuel which is really good but it's 3 times as expensive, people would just not buy it, and therefore it would not be viable. That's where, as I mentioned before, there's different technologies that can leverage different parts of the market. So SAF, for instance, something that if it can become at cost parity or close parity with the kerosene-based systems, then airplanes will very easily just swap, because the logistics is there, is the same logistics. The aircraft don't need to change the turbines. It's something very simple to implement, and therefore you're already reducing the carbon footprint of the aviation industry by, I think there's a studies of 30%. That's one thing. So cheap SAF at cost parity or similar, that's what Sparky Fuels is trying to do, is going to be something very important. Second one is in the future, aviation is trying to go to hydrogen for the long-haul flights and regional flights with cryogenic hydrogen and just compressed hydrogen, depending on systems. For that, you also need clean hydrogen, green hydrogen to be cheap, and also the logistics of it to be working, because if you are going to have an aircraft that flies on hydrogen, you need to have at the airport cryogenic hydrogen systems, you need to transport it to the airport, you need to move it into the airplane, and you need to have quick refueling times, because that's also the companies need to do, because an aircraft that doesn't fly is an aircraft that doesn't bring money. So there needs to be a work on hydrogen, on reducing that cost of the logistics, but also on the green production of it. And finally, for batteries, batteries are good for the low end of the spectrum, the short flights, which could enable some regional flight routes existing. And for that, the automotive industry has helped us a lot, because it's prices of batteries have just gone down very quickly. Now they're starting to go into lower end energy densities. We need higher up, so we just need to get those ones cheaper, and then we would be able to get some short flights on battery electric, then hydrogen coming off, and then SAF as the system for every flight that's going on now.
So I just wanted to ask on that, because an airline said to me they're ordering planes today which will be delivered in 6-7 years' time and will be operational for 30 years, right? And those are going to be hydrocarbon-based.
Yes.
So where's the airline's appetite for taking the risk to say, we think the infrastructure is going to be ready, it will be ready?
So that's one of the very good things about e-fuels, about SAF, is that they can buy the airplane now, and as you mentioned, the backlog of Airbus and Boeing is 6 to 7 years, and then an airplane can fly for 30 years and even be extended to 50 years. So yeah, definitely there's, and the turbo machines can last for a long time, and they cost also several millions. So definitely that there's something in there, but they also know that SAF only allows for 30% reduction in carbon footprint, and aerospace industry is always, there's more and more flights, more and more things. So at the end, it will become unsustainable unless we get carbon capture to also work, which is something which is pretty difficult. That's where hydrogen comes in, and for short, long haul, the idea from Airbus, for instance, is to work on longer flights with hydrogen carbon, with hydrogen fuel burn, and those are in the market for 2050, but airlines need to think about 2050, because when they're thinking about their strategy for the future, they need to think about infrastructure. They need to think about how can I operate from Heathrow with hydrogen. If they don't have hydrogen, it doesn't work. So things need to move now in order to have planes flying in 30 years with alternative fuels.
Okay. Similar question, similar vein for you, Mathias, in chemical synthesis. I mean, Fischer-Tropsch, who've been around, again, well understood, well known, but what other things have got to happen? What things should happen for products like yours to become a reality?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess what's important, what Ignacio also said, this sustainable aviation fuel market is a very, very nice example for really how to bring down costs and what's needed right now really to bring down cost and also to initiate a market somehow. So what you currently have with sustainable aviation fuels, especially for e-fuels, they are around about 4 to 5 times more expensive than fossil fuels. And obviously long-term, nobody would like to pay that. But the good thing with e-fuels is that if you think about what you actually need to produce e-fuels, that's electricity in the end, and you have chemical facilities and chemical processes that are quite good scalable and where you can bring down cost and capex cost quite well. That means that in the end, where you would end up is around about 1.5 to 2 times fossil fuel price. And that's something where you then also are in a range where you are in par with fossil plus emission prices. That's exactly where you then would like to end. And the thing is just that right now at the beginning, obviously 4 to 5 times more expensive than fossil fuel. That's for an airline which has very small margins, that's very difficult to pay. That's why, especially in the aviation industry, mandates were caught up by the European Union, for example, but also by other regulators to actually build a business case also for an airline then in the end to buy these more expensive fuels at the beginning. Because buying SAF, which is more expensive as a fuel, is still cheaper than if you would buy fossil fuel and have to pay for the penalties for using fossil fuels, which is really driven by the regulator. And in the European Union, for example, the EU decided to have mandates up to 70% of sustainable aviation fuels until 2050, and that's a lot, like 70% of all jet fuel must be sustainable and half of it must be e-fuels. So that's really driving this market development, but also now to bring down these costs long term, what's also important there is obviously, first of all, you need energy or inputs as cheap as possible, and that's really from renewables. That's also what we are working on, to make these renewables possible to be used and to decrease your cost. Then obviously you also need efficient technologies to have a high efficiency in the process, to not use or lose any of the electricity that you put in. And then the other thing that you definitely need is this CapEx cost regression. And therefore standardization of your processes is very important. And what's also very important is really to repetitively build your facilities. That doesn't mean that you want small facilities or small containers, because there the economies of scale are very often unfavorable. But you also don't want to have to re-engineer your facility for each different location in a world-scale setup. But you want to repetitively deploy and deploy and deploy to really bring down this cost curve and then also decrease the CapEx cost.
Perfect. Okay. I'm just going to give a warning that if there's questions in the audience, I'll have them ready. We're going to do one more question, and I'll come back if people have got questions they'd like to ask the panel. Mathias, you just mentioned about using some kind of existing infrastructure would help bring down those costs, and I know it's something that Frederik you mentioned before. But what current infrastructure do you think can be repurposed, reused to help bring that cost curve down and accelerate the adoption?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, because I think that's one of the learnings from the hype that we've seen in hydrogen a couple of years back. That the idea was always, okay, we need to, the vehicles need to be there, the fuel cells needs to be there, but then the hydrogen wasn't there, and in a lot of cases still is not there. So I think for e-fuels specifically, the big differentiation is between drop-in fuels for airlines, for aerospace industries. So I think there the advantage is that you can basically reuse the existing infrastructure. I know that Spark, for example, is working or has worked with Rolls-Royce in the past, and to certify the output that certifies a SAF for their engines. And I think that's something that's well understood in a highly regulated airline industry, where the SAF needs to basically meet the same specifications and requirements and safety standards that we have seen for the last 50 plus years. And I think matching those safety requirements and standards is fairly straightforward. I think for maritime applications, the situation is a bit different. So for methanol and ammonia, you first of all need new engines. So you need to replace your fleet. And in preparation for this panel, I had the chance to talk to our advisor, who is a former executive from Maersk, so to get just a sense of where the maritime industry is going and where the shipping industry is going. And the trend seems to be very clear that green methanol seems to be the winner, with up to like 50% of the ships running on green methanol by 2030. At least that's the target. But then again, in order to avoid like a situation where similar to hydrogen, where there's then the chance that there is no supply, they're basically hedging this by buying dual-use engines. So they can always still rely on the traditional bunker fuel. So I think that's one difference. And then the other part is that the maritime and shipping industry is just, in terms of fuel, is just way more centralized. So there are just a few ports globally which take up the majority of the volume for refueling, especially Singapore. For us sitting in Hong Kong, we see that very closely, that refueling for these big cargo ships typically takes place in Singapore. And then some of these ships actually make all the way to Europe, probably fill up a little bit, but definitely not complete, and then turn around and then being filled up in Singapore again. So in order to produce fuel and in order to save CO2 and basically makes this feasible, you actually obviously have to be where the demand is. And I think, again, for SAF and for that industry, I think that's a bit more straightforward, because there are just a lot of airports globally. But fueling station for maritime, again, would depend largely on those centers. and they're not always favorable for producing green methanol just because you either don't have cheap electricity or water or CO2 for that matter. So I think, again, it will depend on the industry a lot, how much of the existing infrastructure you can use, and then also location and geography.
Okay. And for aviation, I mean, that must be a big challenge as well, because you don't have the energy density with hydrogen as you do with kerosene, as you kind of mentioned, right? So what infrastructure do you think that is already in play could be repurposed, reused?
So hydrogen, I know that the natural gas elements can already be used for hydrogen, so that's one of the infrastructure that could be used, but definitely it doesn't really go to airports, so that's one thing that needs to be brought on. Energy density of hydrogen actually pretty good. The problem is volume density. You need to basically make the aircraft half hydrogen and then half people. That's one of the things that's happening with it, even if you go for cryocooling. But yeah, definitely we need to improve on the tanks, we need to improve on the energy density of the systems. Same thing as for batteries, because even hydrogen systems will need batteries, and batteries are also heavy. So yeah, there's definitely some work to be done in there. So technology needs to improve that energy density at the same time as it improves cost. Since both things are important. In an aircraft, if you have more weight, it means you need to burn more fuel, and therefore you actually need more energy, which means you have more cost. And you may actually not even be able to fly if you actually go into that vicious circle too far. So yeah, definitely hydrogen is there. There's compressed, there's liquid, depending on the use case you want to do. Both are viable options, and I've seen projects that actually have them as being able to do long-haul flights. So it is definitely viable. It's just technology still needs to improve to get those technologies ready. Okay. And the logistics, of course, to be ready.
Perfect. So I did give you a warning. Are there any questions anybody in the room would want to ask the panel at this stage? Looks like that's a no. So we'll move on to the last question for the panel then. One of the critical things that people have said about the transition away from hydrocarbons is, if you take lithium-ion batteries, for example, there's an inherent amount of embedded carbon in the lithium-ion battery. You have to extract the minerals, cobalt, manganese are in critical supply. And people often say that in the end, they're going to be more polluting than a hydrocarbon. Right? I think the room, and we're all converts here, but what do you think, and what is the most compelling argument that says those naysayers are wrong? I'll come to Mathias, you first.
No, absolutely. I guess it's super important really to not only take CO2 emissions into account, but really look at the full picture, like also the other environmental impact that this development and also the deployment of these facilities, for example, or different type of technologies, or really having also on biodiversity, for example, really depends on where the mining, for example, takes place. But what's also very important to say is that most of the technologies, like for example in our case in e-fuels production, if you really look at this full life cycle assessment from really building your wind and solar farms at the beginning, then having this full deployment of your conversion technologies, then also using the fuel in the existing infrastructure, then actually your life cycle assessment is quite positive for still using these fuels overall. What we, for example, use as raw materials or raw earths, for example, is cobalt in catalyst, for example, and there definitely the extraction technologies right now are not optimal, but it doesn't mean that the technology is not favorable. It really means that in this extraction, also in this overall process, that must be improved, but it doesn't mean that the technology itself is negative. So I guess you really have to distinguish between the technology itself and also how you get the different input factors and also the environment for it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Also, one thing I may say is that batteries in particular, they're very different from hydrocarbons in the fact that hydrocarbon, you burn it, and that's it. It's in the air. You cannot take it back. Batteries, there are several works on circular economy that are working in there. There's companies, for instance, in aviation, as soon as the battery is below 90%, we just don't want it anymore because of the problem of weight versus energy. But that means that it doesn't mean that the battery then goes to the trash. It means that if we build a really good circular economy, we'll be able to take that battery, put it into energy storage for ground operations where the weight is not an issue. And then once that's done, there's a lot of companies out here, I even know some are out here in this summit, they're working on recycling batteries. Red Bull Materials has shown that you can recycle 95% of a battery cell. And that's something that people don't think when they think about the cost of the batteries. Batteries, you think that you just throw it to the landslide, and that's not what we should do. We should recycle them. Also, batteries are changing the materials they have. 5 years ago, cobalt was a big issue in batteries. Now, almost no battery has cobalt or has traces of it. So the materials will also change, the technology will change, and that's something that we can cope with because batteries will continue to evolve and recycling will continue to evolve. So the cost of it in the full lifetime of it will be much, much lower than whatever happens with hydrocarbons.
Got it.
Yeah, no, I think I would agree to what Ignacio and Mathias just said. I mean, the question is, it's always a question of alternatives, right? So of course we can hope and pray that fusion probably is ready tomorrow and solve a lot of our problems, probably not all of them, but a lot. And I think the same is true for hydrocarbons, batteries, and the technologies that we just discussed. I mean, none of these are perfect, for sure, right? I mean, it's not that any of them will solve these problems in terms of emissions, in terms of resources, in terms of land use, in terms of water consumption, for example, is also a big topic for a lot of these technologies. But then my other way of looking at this is that I think the world is not going to stop flying or is not going to stop shipping, right? Tomorrow we are traveling constantly. We came all the way here from Hong Kong. There are probably hundreds of millions of people out there that still haven't been on a plane for the first time in their life, and they want to fly, right? If you look at the order books of Airbus and Boeing, they're full, right? Like there's going to be more and more consumption of oil. The fossil fuel and kerosene alone is going to triple, or is projected to triple between now and 2030. So again, what I would say is, yes, in an ideal world, we could sort of stop using fossil fuels tomorrow and replace it with something that is perfect in terms of it's emission-free, there's no waste, it's not resource-intensive, but I think the best option we have today is working on these technologies that at least reduce CO2 emissions, probably then capture them and turn them carbon negative until we hopefully then one day get fusion or some other breakthroughs technology.
Great. Thank you. Just reflecting what everybody's just said over the questions in a way, that because the world said we need to stop generating CO2 and greenhouse gases, that the kind of problem's been set, right? And that needs the dislocation, the disruption then occurs because founders and entrepreneurs have got a very clear problem set that they can go after. The buy part of that economy now is starting to come forward, of people saying, if you can, at this price point, we would buy.
Yep.
Right? And so it's starting to take form, and I think the bit which is hopefully getting clearer is that there's a lot of existing infrastructure that can be repurposed, can be reused to help bring that cost curve down. So there's hope yet that we could get there quicker than we think.
Yep.
Perfect. Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.